Dear friends, today's talk, as you see from the title, is dedicated to the issue: can Buddhism be helpful in establishing wisdom society? The straight answer, yes or no, it's impossible, because for the very simple reason that what is called Buddhism is a network of confusion. There is around slightly below people statistically considered as below 500 million of people considered Buddhist, most of them in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. For example, in Thailand, 93% population is considered to be Buddhism. In Cambodia, 97%, and in Sri Lanka, 70%. Bhutan, 74%. So there are countries which considered to be Buddhist, there's a vast majority. Are these countries even closely resembling wisdom society? Well, the answer could be here very definite: not at all. They are some ridden by corruption, all based on patriarchy and fight for money and fanaticism, like what it was happening recently in Myanmar, killing, or what was happening in Sri Lanka when they decimated the Tamils, etc., etc. So what these people call themselves Buddhists because they probably, it's very difficult to say, I haven't been and witnessed that, they have some monastery temples and go and maybe do some prayers, and definitely, and that's for sure, put money to support this whole monastic and system. Oh, that is unquestionable. So the whole thing is based on donation of money, which supposedly gives them good karma, etc. Otherwise, they have no clue what Buddhism is all about. But even the countries which you would consider should be more refined, like, for example, I'm looking at the list, and Bhutan or Nepal, where survived the most refined, supposedly refined form of Buddhism, Vajrayana, are also ridden by poverty, corruption, very strong stratification, and patriarchy. That's that. And we can whitewash the way we want, but that's the reality, and admire their temples, etc. We can be angry at Chinese for destroying Tibetan Buddhism, which was busy destroying, corrupting itself before even Chinese came, and continue doing it quite successfully, in spite being admired and followed by some Westerners. So why at all I even bother to bring the Buddhism into the picture of not enlightened, forgive me, for wisdom society. It's an old habit from my Trungpa times when I was extremely enthusiastic about his idea of creating enlightened society, which, as we well know, became a fiasco. But the idea was great, except what killed the idea was that he couldn't get rid of himself of the Tibetan, traditional, or Tibetan tradition, not tradition, which lasted, hardly changed since early middle-aged, and introduced their king, queen, generals, ministers, whatnot. And of course, it was nonsense to propose such things into 20 and 20, and even not even in 20 society, and even more, it's an obvious nonsense now. So his very idea, however, it was based on the idea which I think is great and very valid, that human being has so-called basic goodness, potential for get rid of its beliefs, which I will talk in a moment about. So now let's jump 2,500 years backwards to a person who, though there is no written materials which will confirm, but according to oral tradition, was called Shakyamuni Buddha or Gautama Buddha, etc. Buddha simply means awake in Sanskrit, and Shakyamuni, that was Shakya. Muni is great, Shakya is sage, so great awakened sage. There is, I would say, no doubt that person similar to portrayed as a Buddha exists, because about some 300 years later, Emperor Ashoka, who converted himself into Buddhism, mentioned various Buddhists, mentioned Buddha, and wanted to base his enormous empire on the various things which could resemble Buddhist principles. What is the most important, in my view, what Buddha, which is attributed to Buddha, is so-called three noble truths, I would say. Oh no, sorry. 3 poisons, 4 noble truths. I know that. But 3 poisons. That what is destroying and preventing humans to awake is possessiveness, aggression, and ignorance. Possessiveness, it's obvious. We want to possess material goods or intellectual goods. Aggression comes from defending what we possess and trying to acquire more than we possess. And ignorance is believing that this whole system really exists as such, that reality is as we conceptualize this in an existence. He called unknowing, Marikpa, unknowing, ignorance. That was pretty brilliant when you think it happened 2,500 years ago. in the midst of the most stratified society imaginable, which was present India, with the Hindu religion, which was incredibly patriarchal social system based on castes, etc. Person could could see it so clearly. Well, he apparently did. And he also, apparently, according to the stories, suggested that the way to avoid it is to stay away from material goods, from anything which will promote it. And they also now say that he proposed a certain form of mind training. About that, it is difficult to say because the tradition is only oral, but let's believe it that it was a certain form of mindfulness training. That would make sense. His Sangha, his followers, were celibate, were monks in the beginning, only men who lived only on the basis of, they were beggars on what they were get, had one bowl where they get their food, and that's all, and some clothing made of sewed together rags, and they couldn't have any houses to stay in, and they moved from place to place. Obviously, they were viewed as fairly noble, and there was no any, at least stories about violence and persecution of them. In the contrary. So that makes complete sense. And Buddhism I will not present the history, but the very important things start happening about 500 years later. This something called, basically following the pure Buddha teaching, whatever it was, it's called Theravadin, and it is very, very popular in Asia. But about 500 years later appear Mahayana. Maha is great, Yana is vehicle. And they put down the others immediately, called them Hinayana, little vehicle, and they added to this teaching two very important things. One, that humans and basically all beings possess something called Buddha nature, that is potential for becoming enlightened, free from all this false beliefs, as they say, as well as they propagate compassion and seeing the other as more important than oneself. Sounds pretty wonderful, except here I will say something extremely cynical. It is not usually used. I see it that in spite maybe there was not intention, it was simply a technique to deconcentrate oneself on belief in solid existence of I, and look more towards the other that will soften our attachment. Why? Because did they really help this other? No, any proof for that. poverty was as it was, caste system existed as it was. They usually, the Mahayanis, were people very well educated, which came from the highest Brahmin class, etc. And it was going on and on for a while. It branched in 18 schools, and also from that most likely emerged two streams, one called Mahamudra, which is apparently the first written documents are so-called Song of Realization of Saraha, who was apparently introduced to it, what's very interesting, by two women. That's quite interesting. In this patriarchal society, they were apparently his teacher, and since Saraha started the lineage of Mahasiddhas, etc. The other thing which beginning is completely mythical, there is no, it started from primordial Dharmakaya Buddha Samantabhadra via Vajrasattva, was transmitted to first human being and continue. Looks suspicious. It is timing is very similar. It was pretty parallel to Mahamudra. The other stream called Mahaati, great perfection, Mahamudra, great symbol, existed in India until when the Muslims attacked India and conquered the whole, most of India with the exception of the southern tip. They somehow didn't get there. They eradicated Buddhism completely, and this both lineage Mahamudra and Mahaati continue themselves in Tibet. Mahaati called Dzogchen. Maha is again Ati perfection. Dzogchen means the same, great perfection. They are very interesting, and though they don't have any pretenses of being scientific, particularly when you read a good translation of one of the greatest exponent of Dzogchen, by name Longchenpa. It was 14th century in Tibet, which I personally, one of his books I'm using on advice of my person, Dzigar Control, who told me that that's sufficient for me to study and practice what is in this book, and that I do. And I must say, it does work. I practiced Buddhism before for, 30 years, and Vajrayana, enormous sadhanas, and this and this and that. Did it all dutifully and with great gusto, not liking 1 minute of that. I will not go into my story too much. Anyway, I have the feeling that these two lineage, if we strip all the anecdotal, metaphorical, poetic thing and translate them into the language of modern neuropsychology, neuroscience, and modern physics, or maybe even we will have to upgrade them both, could be extremely useful. And we don't need to call them even Buddhism, because not to get involved in this growing Buddhist scandals, Buddhist discussion, this diarrhea of talking, which is spurred by internet, Facebook, Reddit, well, whatever it is going. Everybody has something to say. That really confuses. So to end this thing, I believe that there are elements in this whole great plethora of things called Buddhism which could be very, very useful. And that was the reason that they are incorporated into the wisdom training. The various teachings from Madhyamika and teachings of Trekcho, that's part of the Dzogchen, because they are extremely simple and can be presented to many people. Because the problem with even the greatest intention and purest form of Buddhism was that it was deeply elitist, not that it intended to be elitist. It was elitist by the very nature that to dedicate yourself to the proposed practice completely will eliminate any form of so-called normal life. So the part of in this 500 million of so-called Buddhists, maybe there is a minuscule fraction of people who really know what they are doing. Most of them believe that Buddha was some form of a god, etc. So, and that's why, in spite of suggesting that the Wisdom Society is free from any religious and other beliefs, there are elements in what generally we call Buddhism, elements in their views which could be used by science, and their practices which can be used to the training of the mind, which is presented. It's extremely tempting to talk how we could translate the various Dzogchen and Mahamudra views in or Vajrayana into language of modern science, but at this point I don't feel qualified because my hypotheses are going too far, and I have no trace of proof that they are. But I hope that somebody, physicist or neuropsychologist, will look closely at that and try to see how they can be what is proposed explained, and how this discipline can be further developed to embrace it. So, on this positive note, I end this talk, and until see you again, my dear friends, goodbye.